The Thompsons appeared to be the quintessential family, enjoying wealth, success, and an idyllic life in their expansive suburban residence. To their neighbors, they represented the ideal of happiness, a family that evoked envy. However, the truth behind their closed doors was starkly different. Grace Thompson had married Andrew 2 years following the death of her first husband. Andrew was charming, affluent, and treated Grace's daughter, Sophie, as if she were his own. Now 19, Sophie was a college freshman pursuing a degree in psychology, a bright and spirited young woman who had been the focal point of Grace's life since her birth. Initially, their blended family appeared to thrive, with Andrew lavishing Sophie with expensive gifts and abundant attention. Grace felt a sense of relief, believing she had finally found a partner who would care for both her and her daughter. However, as time passed, she began to notice unsettling signs, whispered conversations between Andrew and Sophie, the way he gazed at her when he thought Grace was not observing, and a sudden change in Sophie's demeanor. One evening, Grace returned home early from a work trip to find the house unusually silent. As she ascended the stairs, she heard a muffled sound emanating from Sophie's room. Her heart raced as she approached the slightly ajar door. What she witnessed inside sent a chill through her veins. Andrew was in bed with Sophie, her daughter, and her husband. The shock momentarily immobilized Grace, but she quickly retreated, her mind racing and her heart pounding. How long had this been occurring? How could they betray her in such a manner? Overwhelmed, Grace fled the house, driving aimlessly into the night. Her thoughts were a tumultuous whirlwind as night fell. Grace had dedicated her life to Sophie, sacrificing everything for her daughter's happiness, and she had placed her trust in Andrew, giving him her heart, her life, and her family. The betrayal she experienced was unbearable. When she finally returned home, dawn was approaching. Grace compelled herself to remain composed, to act as if nothing had transpired. She recognized the necessity of time to process what she had witnessed and to determine her next steps. However, one thing was clear: she would not allow them to escape the consequences of their actions. In the subsequent days, Grace meticulously masked her emotions, feigning normalcy. She went through the motions of everyday life, yet internally, she was consumed by anger and pain. She observed Andrew and Sophie closely, scrutinizing every interaction and glance they exchanged. Andrew, unaware that Grace was privy to their secret, maintained his facade of the ideal husband. Each morning, he kissed Grace goodbye, reassured her of his love, and made plans for their future. It was all a deception, and Grace was acutely aware of it. Conversely, Sophie became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding Grace whenever possible. Her guilt was palpable, evident in her refusal to meet her mother's gaze. Grace could sense Sophie's fear, which only intensified her own fury. As Grace continued to gather evidence of their affair, she felt herself becoming colder and more calculating. She meticulously documented their clandestine meetings, capturing photographs and saving text messages found on Andrew's phone. She understood that she could confront them at any moment, but Grace was no longer content with a mere confrontation. She craved revenge that would leave them utterly shattered. As her plans began to crystallize in her mind, Grace resolved to eliminate both Andrew and Sophie, ensuring that her actions would leave no trace back to her. She was acutely aware that they believed they held the advantage, continuing their affair without fear of repercussions, yet they had gravely underestimated her determination. One afternoon, while Andrew was at work, Grace invited Sophie to sit with her in the kitchen. Sophie appeared anxious, sensing the tension in the air. "Is there something you wish to share with me?" Grace inquired, her tone steady and composed. Sophie's complexion drained of color as she shook her head, denying any wrongdoing. "No, Mom, please." Grace leaned closer, her gaze intense. "I am aware of your relationship with Andrew." The ensuing silence was palpable, and Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears as she began to stutter an apology. Grace raised her hand to silence her. "I do not wish to hear your excuses," she stated coldly. "You have made your choices, and now you must face the consequences." Sophie's tears streamed down her face. "Mom, I never intended for this to happen. He said he loved me." Grace's heart twisted with a blend of anger and sorrow. "He is a liar, Sophie. Because of him, we are all going to suffer." In that moment, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. she could not bear to look at Sophie, let alone engage with her. The betrayal had inflicted a wound too deep, and every glance at her daughter reminded her of what had been lost: trust, innocence, and the bond they once cherished. Meanwhile, Andrew continued to act as if everything was normal, but Grace was not deceived. She could see through his pretense, recognizing the guilt that flickered in his eyes whenever he met her gaze. He was acutely aware that the dynamics between them had irrevocably shifted. Grace found herself unable to identify the exact reason for her growing distance from both Andrew and Sophie. She began to withdraw, spending extended hours at work to avoid returning home until late at night. When she was at home, she isolated herself in her bedroom, locking the door behind her. Andrew attempted to engage her in conversation multiple times, but Grace dismissed him, attributing her behavior to work-related stress. In truth, she was biding her time, waiting for the opportune moment to execute her plan. Meanwhile, Sophie was in turmoil, acutely aware that she had damaged her relationship with her mother and feeling utterly lost on how to mend it. She loathed herself for her actions, yet she was also deeply infatuated with Andrew. This love was toxic and complicated, and Sophie recognized it, but she felt powerless to change her feelings. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Grace sensed the tension like a heavy mist enveloping them. She understood that she needed to take action before the strain became unbearable. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Grace decided to confront Andrew. She waited until he was settled in his study, illuminated only by a solitary lamp. As she entered, he looked up from his book, a smile gracing his face, which quickly vanished upon seeing the expression in her eyes. "Grace, what's wrong?" he inquired, concern evident in his voice. Grace hesitated before responding, walking over to his desk and placing a collection of photographs and printed text messages in front of him. Andrew's face drained of color as he comprehended the gravity of the situation. "Grace, I don't," he began, but she interrupted him. "Don't you dare try to justify this. I know everything, Andrew." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words emerged. He found himself ensnared. He understood the reason behind Grace's demand, her voice quivering with barely restrained fury. "Why would you do this to me, to us?" she asked. Andrew finally responded, his voice scarcely above a whisper, "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. I'm sorry, Grace. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Grace echoed, her voice escalating. "You've destroyed me. You've destroyed this family." Andrew had no reply. He lowered his head, aware that no words could rectify the situation. Grace remained still for a long moment, her hands balled into fists at her sides. She felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to strike him, to inflict upon him the anguish she was experiencing, yet she recognized that such actions would not suffice, nothing would be adequate. Eventually, she turned and exited the room, leaving Andrew in silence as she ascended the stairs to her bedroom. Grace was resolute. She could not allow him to evade the consequences of his actions, nor could she permit either of them to escape accountability. Her plan was already in motion. She understood the necessity of caution, that she must not allow her emotions to cloud her judgment. It was imperative to think clearly and to meticulously plan every detail if she intended to ensure that Andrew and Sophie faced repercussions for their deeds. Over the ensuing weeks, Grace began to establish the foundation for her strategy. She initiated minor adjustments, subtle changes that went unnoticed by Andrew and Sophie. Initially, she suggested they take different routes to work or start locking the doors at night. She sowed seeds of doubt in their minds, prompting them to question each other's intentions and actions. Concurrently, Grace began to create distance between herself and them. Friends and colleagues noticed a significant change in her behavior. She ceased going out, stopped answering calls, and began to spend more time in solitude. She aimed to project an image of struggle, as if she were on the brink of collapse, which was all part of her strategy. One evening, Grace proposed to Ed that they embark on a family vacation, describing it as a last-ditch effort to salvage their family ties. Andrew, eager to rectify the situation, agreed without hesitation. Initially, Sophie was hesitant, but Grace persuaded her that this was the only path to healing. They settled on a secluded cabin in the woods, far removed from the city and prying eyes. This location held significance for them, as they had visited it early in their marriage, and Grace was familiar with it. It was the ideal backdrop for her intentions. As they packed their belongings and prepared for the journey, Grace's heart raced with anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for, equipped with everything she needed to execute her plan. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, yet the tension within the vehicle was palpable. Andrew attempted to engage in light conversation, but Grace's replies were curt and distant. Sophie gazed out the window, her mind racing with thoughts about what the weekend might entail, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss, though she could not identify the source. Upon their arrival at the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken apprehension. The cabin stood isolated, enveloped by dense woods, and the silence felt almost suffocating. Grace inhaled deeply as she exited the car, acutely aware of the gravity of her impending actions. Grace went through the motions of settling into the cabin. She unpacked their belongings, prepared a modest dinner, and attempted to maintain a cheerful atmosphere. However, each forced smile felt like a dagger twisting in her heart. As night descended, they gathered around the fireplace, the crackling flames being the only sound that filled the room. Andrew and Sophie exchanged knowing glances, both acutely aware that something was amiss, yet neither dared to confront the issue. Grace observed them, her mind calculating and her heart growing colder. Eventually, she rose and declared her intention to retire for the night. Andrew offered to accompany her, but she declined, expressing a need for solitude. He hesitated for a moment before nodding, watching her retreat down the hallway. Sophie lingered by the fire, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. A profound sense of unease settled over her, accompanied by a nagging intuition that something dreadful loomed ahead. She dismissed these thoughts, convincing herself that she was merely being overly cautious. As she finally made her way to bed, Sophie could not shake the feeling that this was merely the calm before the storm. In the dead of night, Grace quietly slipped out of bed. She had been anticipating this moment, and now it was time to take action. Moving through the cabin with the stealth of a predator, her heart raced with a blend of fear and excitement. Grace made her way to the kitchen and retrieved a bottle of wine she had brought with her. She poured herself a glass and discreetly added a few drops of a powerful sedative she had procured. She was confident it would be sufficient to incapacitate them for several hours, granting her the time she required. She then returned to the living room, where Andrew and Sophie remained. Grace accepted the situation without hesitation, too dazed to fully comprehend her surroundings. Miss Sophie also stirred, prompting Grace to offer her a glass. "Let us raise one final toast," Grace declared, her voice unnaturally serene. "To new beginnings." They clinked their glasses together, and Grace observed as they both drank deeply. Within moments, the sedative took hold, Andrew and Sophie's heads fell back, their eyes fluttering shut as they succumbed to unconsciousness. Grace stood over them, her heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment she had long awaited. A wave of adrenaline coursed through her, instilling a sense of invincibility. Without a moment's pause, she began her task, binding Andrew's hands and feet with rope, ensuring the knots were secure. She repeated the process with Sophie, her hands quivering slightly as she tightened the bindings. She was determined not to inflict harm, yet she needed to ensure they could not escape. Once both were firmly restrained, Grace settled into a chair across from them, awaiting their awakening. A peculiar calm enveloped her, as if the turmoil within had finally been unleashed. It was time for them to face the consequences. When Andrew and Sophie eventually regained consciousness, they appeared dazed and confused. It took them a moment to grasp the reality of their predicament, but once they did, panic ensued. They struggled against their restraints, but it was futile, they were ensnared. Grace observed them in silence, her gaze devoid of warmth. A perverse satisfaction filled her as she witnessed the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization that they were entirely at her mercy. As Grace sat by the fire, she gently roused Andrew from his slumber, offering him a glass of wine. "What are you doing?" Andrew demanded, his voice trembling. Grace paused, allowing the silence to linger, observing the growing panic in both of them. "Why are you doing this?" Sophie cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, please." Finally, Grace spoke, her tone calm and devoid of emotion. "You both betrayed me, and now you will face the consequences of your actions." Andrew's face contorted with anger. Grace, you're not thinking clearly. Let us go, and we can discuss this. But Grace merely shook her head. There is nothing to discuss, Andrew. I have seen everything, the messages, the photographs, the deceit. You both repulse me. Sophie sobbed, her words barely intelligible through her tears. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never intended to hurt you. I didn't know what I was doing. Grace's expression remained unchanged. You were fully aware of your actions, Sophie, and so was Andrew. Andrew attempted to reason with her, but Grace was beyond listening, beyond forgiveness. She had reached her limit and was determined to make them suffer. Rising from her seat, she approached Andrew, who was bound. I loved you, Andrew. I trusted you, and you squandered it all for what? For this? Andrew looked up at her, desperation in his eyes. Grace, please don't do this. We can resolve this, we can return to how things were. But Grace's laughter was cold and bitter. There is no going back, not after what you have done. She turned away from him, moving towards Sophie. And you, Sophie, you were my daughter, my only child. I would have done anything for you, but now you are just as culpable as he is. Sophie's sobs intensified, her body trembling with fear. Mom, I'm begging you, don't do this. Grace remained unperturbed, experiencing only a chilling sense of satisfaction as she readied herself to execute the final phase of her scheme. She understood that there was no possibility of retreat. She had arrived at a point of no return and was compelled to see her plan through to completion. She had already stripped them of everything, their freedom, their trust, their dignity, and now she intended to take their lives. With deliberate care, she retrieved a knife from the kitchen, its blade glinting in the subdued light. This particular knife had been chosen with precision, as it was the ideal instrument for her impending actions. Having contemplated this moment for an extended period, it was finally upon her. As she approached Sophie, the girl's eyes widened in terror. Mom, no. Please don't. Grace faltered for an instant, her determination wavering. However, the memories of betrayal, deceit, and the anguish they had inflicted upon her surged back, fortifying her resolve. She steeled herself, lifting the knife high above her head. Just as she was about to deliver the fatal blow, Sophie screamed, the sound shattering the stillness and jolting Grace back to reality. She stumbled backward, the knife slipping from her grasp. For a brief moment, Grace stood there, trembling, as the enormity of what she had nearly done washed over her. Consumed by her fury and desire for vengeance, she had come perilously close to committing the unimaginable, taking the life of her own daughter. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she gazed down at Sophie, who was still weeping uncontrollably. Andrew was shouting something, but Grace was unable to hear him over the thunderous beating of her own heart. She retreated, her mind racing, thoughts swirling chaotically. What had she become? What had this betrayal transformed her into? Grace abruptly turned and fled the cabin, stepping into the frigid night air. Uncertain of her destination, she felt an overwhelming need to escape the chaos that had engulfed her. She sprinted through the forest, her feet striking the ground with urgency, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. It was not until she reached the precipice of a cliff that she paused, the wind tousling her hair as she gazed down at the rocky shoreline below. For a fleeting moment, Grace contemplated the finality of ending her life. A single step could erase all the pain, anger, guilt, and shame that weighed heavily upon her. However, as she stood there, peering at the jagged rocks, a profound realization dawned upon her: taking her life would not rectify the betrayal, restore trust, or eliminate her suffering. With a deep breath, she resolutely stepped back from the edge. She had come too far to allow Andrew and Sophie to dictate her fate. She possessed a strength that transcended their actions. Turning away, she made her way back to the cabin, her thoughts clearer than they had been in weeks. Upon her return, she discovered Andrew and Sophie still bound, their eyes wide with fear as she entered. Yet, Grace was no longer the wrathful figure who had left them. She was composed, her heart burdened by the gravity of her near decision. Without uttering a word, she began to untie them, her hands trembling as she loosened the knots. Neither Andrew nor Sophie dared to speak, caught between fear and relief at the transformation they witnessed. Grace stepped back, having emerged from danger, her gaze cast downward, unable to meet their eyes. "I am sorry," she murmured, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Andrew rose, rubbing his wrist where the ropes had left their marks, at a loss for words and unsure of how to respond. Sophie remained seated, tears streaming down her cheeks, her body still quaking with fear. Turning away from them, Grace could not confront the reality of her actions. Her anger had consumed her, driving her to the brink of madness, nearly obliterating the very thing she sought to protect: her family. With slow, deliberate steps, she approached the door, not daring to look back as she opened it and stepped into the cold night. Uncertain of her destination, she felt an urgent need to escape the haunting memories of the cabin. As she ventured into the darkness, a profound sense of loss enveloped her, an emptiness she recognized would remain unfilled. She had lost everything: her husband, her daughter, and most importantly, herself. Yet, she was still alive, which meant there was still a chance to make amends. Though the path ahead would be arduous and not achieved overnight, Grace understood the necessity of trying. She needed to discover a way to forgive herself, to move forward, and to reconstruct the life that had been shattered. Thus, with only the clothes on her back and the burden of her guilt weighing heavily upon her, Grace stepped into the night, resolute in her quest for healing. Months passed, but eventually, Grace found her way back to herself. She relocated to a small town, far removed from the city, where no one recognized her name, allowing her the opportunity to start anew. She discovered a Grace rented a modest apartment and embarked on the arduous journey of healing. She reached out to Sophie, sending letters in an effort to explain her actions and seek forgiveness. This process was long and challenging, but ultimately, Sophie found it in her heart to forgive. They began to cautiously rebuild their relationship, now grounded in a deeper understanding of each other's suffering. Meanwhile, Andrew and Grace finalized their divorce, parting ways amicably. Both moved forward with their lives, carrying the scars of their past but emerging stronger for having endured the experience. Grace recognized that she would always remember the betrayal, the anger, and the turmoil that had engulfed her. However, she also understood that these experiences would not define her. She was more than her mistakes and the rage that had nearly overwhelmed her. She was a survivor, a mother, and a woman who had confronted her darkest moments and emerged resilient. As she stood on the porch of her new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Grace felt a profound sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She had rediscovered herself and was now prepared to embark on a new chapter, one filled with healing, forgiveness, hope, and new beginnings.